Hey, this is Chris. Welcome back to another video about some darkroom topics here. In this video I want to talk about split grade printing. Sort of what it is, when it's useful, and especially when it's not useful, because I see a lot of people on YouTube using split grade printing when it really isn't appropriate for what they're doing. So let's kind of talk about what it is and when to use it, what it's useful for. So multi-grade paper essentially has two parts to the emulsion. There is a part of the emulsion that is sensitive to greenish light. That's our low contrast end. There's another part of the emulsion that's sensitive to blue light, and that tends to be the high contrast end. If we max out our contrast, like we go to the complete zero or double zero contrast end, that's one extreme. The grade 5 or 5 plus, as they usually call it, is the other extreme. Those are the extremes. Those are just simply the green light or the blue light sensitive emulsions. Anything in between, like if we have a grade 1, a grade 2, a grade 3, anything in between those extremes is actually a combination in some ratio, some mix of those two parts of the emulsion. So in other words, a grade 2 might be, 70% of the low contrast end and only 30% of the high contrast end is what makes that particular grade. So anything in between is a combination. Now the way most people talk about split grade printing today is they talk about sort of initially making a print in the enlarger, putting a negative in the enlarger, and usually taking the grade 0 filter, or whatever the lowest contrast grade is, putting that in the enlarger and making a test strip that gives them basically to set the whites. Just to use this print as an example here, a little electrical box on the wall. They would use the grade 0 filter to determine the exposure on these light areas in here, and just where they kind of come into having detail in them. They're not pure white, but they haven't gone gray yet. Something that we want to have as a white. Use a grade 0 filter to figure out exposure. Say that's 10 seconds at grade 0 is what it takes to bring detail into that area without making it go gray. Then they would take a pure black, like in this print, maybe down here underneath this little window frame or something. They would take the grade 5 filter, take the grade 0 filter out, put in a grade 5 filter, and figure out what kind of exposure that needs to just make that pure black area go pure black. Say that's 5 seconds at grade 5. So we had 10 seconds at the 0, 5 seconds at the 5. That gives us our white at one end, our black at the other. Then what they would do is, the proponents of split grade printing, is you would do those two exposures. You do 10 seconds at grade 0, pull that filter out, put the grade 5 in, and do the 5 seconds at grade 5 in our example here, which would then give you sort of the basic contrast for that print. Now, the people who do that always kind of add in this little caveat of, oh, that's your sort of your basic contrast. We may have to fine-tune it a little bit from there, and that's what we'll get into here in a minute. I always get a kick out of that. You hear that a lot in film exposure, and developing as well, even out in the field, where we're going to do this as our basic, and we'll fine-tune it later, So basically, the split printing, the way you see it on YouTube, usually people talking about it, or even in blogs and things, is using the two contrast extremes to sort of set your white points and your black points on your print. Okay. After doing multi-grade printing for many years in the darkroom, I feel that that's really kind of a waste of time to do that, especially if you're just initially printing a negative. And let's talk about why that is. Now, like we mentioned, the paper is these two extremes of contrast, and we're mixing them together to create a grade in the middle, like a contrast grade in between. If we have these little filters, like this is the Kodak set, you can spend a huge amount of time in the darkroom figuring out your test strips for grade 0 and grade 5 and what kind of combination you need to get your print to look, as a starting point for your contrast for your print. You may have just spent the last half an hour, 45 minutes, making little test strips at different times at those extremes of contrast, and what you may have just done was spent the last 45 minutes creating grade 3. These filters, there's 11 of these in my little box of Kodak filters. There's one at each extreme and there's 9 in between. These are pre-made for us. I don't need to make these from scratch. They already exist, they're in the box. If I need grade 3, it's a lot faster and a lot more efficient of my darkroom time to just grab the grade 3 filter and stick it in the enlarger. Don't need to make this from scratch, it's right here. How did the company make these? Well, again, our printing paper has those two extremes of contrast on it. Anything in between is a combination, some ratio of those. What's grade 3? Well, it's Kodak, in this case, making a filter that takes part of our green emulsion and part of our blue emulsion, mixes it together to make something that's called grade 3. Does that sound familiar? Taking part of the low contrast, part of the high contrast, combining it in a ratio to make a certain contrast. That's exactly what split printing is. You see, what these filters are is they're split printing. They're exactly the same thing. They're combining those two parts of the emulsion to make a contrast grade. So, in this case, I've got 11 of these in the box that I don't need to make. So when we first go to make a print from a negative in the darkroom, it's much more efficient use of our time to try it with the filters that are in the box. Don't need to make grade 2, don't need to make 2.5, don't need to make 3, they're right there in the box. And they're much faster to use. A couple of seconds to come up with grade 3, not a half an hour or 45 minutes or something to come up with that kind of contrast. So we need to use our time efficiently in the darkroom. We don't need to make things that are in the box. What I find that I see people doing on YouTube especially is when they're doing the split printing from an initial print sort of point of view, put the enlarger in, they've never seen it before, put the negative in the enlarger, they've never seen the negative printed before, and they start with a grade 0 and they start with a grade 5 to figure this out. Save a lot of time just by trying the filters that are in the box and seeing which one gets you the closest, because chances are what you're doing is creating the hard way something that's already in the box. You don't need to do that. It's sitting right there in the box. So that's why I feel split grade printing initially is a big waste of time. Now, split grade printing does have a very useful aspect to it, and it is a very useful tool for us in the darkroom. Let's talk about when that is. Say I were to make a print like this, and I printed it just for the sake of numbers to use. Say I printed this at grade 3, and I looked at my little test strip at grade 3, and I said, you know, my whites look good, but my blacks are kind of weak. My blacks need to be a little bit blacker. I need a little bit more contrast. Then if I take and I put a grade 3.5 filter in, the initial too soft one was at 3, if I put a 3.5 filter in, I do a test strip and I say, you know, that just got too harsh. My whites still look good, but now my blacks are too black. They're a little bit too harsh, there's a little bit too much contrast. Where I need to be is somewhere between 3.5. That is where split grade printing comes in very handy, and that's actually where split grade printing got its name, didn't it? Because what we're doing is we're splitting between the existing grades, between grade 3, 3.5 in that case. How do we do that? Usually what we do in the darkroom is we back up to the lighter contrast, in that case the grade 3 filter. Say we needed 10 seconds at grade 3 to make that print that was just a little bit too low in contrast. What we can do then is take that grade 3 filter out, stick a grade 5 or whatever our maximum grade filter is, and we can give it a little kind of burst of a few seconds of that high contrast to just kind of set our blacks a little bit and bring them into where we want them. So in the case of like a 10-second print at grade 3, that grade 5 burst is probably going to be 3 or 4 seconds is what it would take to set the blacks a little bit more. Now let's think about what happens if we go too far. If we put that 3.5, if we put that grade 5 filter in and we give it a little bit too much, where are we going to end up eventually? What's 3 plus a bit more of the high contrast end? The next step up. We're going to end up at 3.5, aren't we? Because that's what 3 is, plus a bit more of the high contrast end. We don't need to make 3.5, it's in the box. So if we give too much of our high contrast filter, we're going to end up at a grade that we already have in the box. So what we want to do is split in between those two. In that case, in my example, between 3, 3.5. Don't need to make 3.5 either, but we can go in between. In that case, split grade printing is very useful. It's a very useful tool to have in the darkroom. And that's the actual origin of split grade printing. So when is split grade printing appropriate? It's appropriate when we need to split between the two existing grades in our filter box. When it's not appropriate, definitely in my opinion, is if you're just starting to make a print from a negative and you don't know what the basic contrast for that print is, because it may very well be something that's in the box. Now, looking at my own printing and sort of going back through my record book this morning where I write down all my exposure times and contrasts and what my larger settings are if I want to go back and make another print of the same negative, I looked back to see how far I had to go to come up with an actual split grade print. How far back, how many prints ago it was that I actually said, okay, I did a grade 3 print and I added in the case of what it was a grade 3 print and I added in like 4 seconds of grade 5. to split it between 3 and 3.5. That was actually 40 prints ago. 40. That's of doing prints that are, you know, fairly nice looking prints here. It's a vertical there. These are just straight prints right out of the filter box. That's what, you know, 99% of my prints are straight print. That's a grade 3 print right there. You know, very nice looking print, if I may say so myself, but the filters are almost always existing in the box. I don't need to make them. 40 prints ago, if I had done split printing the way people advocate split printing, just think of the time I would have wasted in the last 40 prints I've made creating contrast grades that are actually right there in the box. Because I would have made a print that looks just like that by making grade 3 the hard way instead of just using the filter. So you don't need to do that. So in a practical sense, making contrast grades the hard way is just not a valuable use of our time. It's much better to just use the ones already made for us. Then if we need to, we can back up a little bit and split between a contrast and the next one up. But we don't need to make the next one up in half stops because that's already made, for half grades because it's already made for us. Like I said, there's 11 filters in this box. Don't need to make any of those. They're already there. So split grade printing, it has its uses for fine tuning. However, it's not really appropriate for making those sort of crude adjustments to begin with to figure out what our base exposure is. And the reason I mentioned that a lot of people will tell you that gets you really close to your, you know, split grade printing gets you close to your print, and then you can fine tune it from there. If you're still having to fine tune it from there, what's the point? Just use the contrast grade that's the closest, back up a little if you need to, and add a little bit more contrast in. That's fine tuning it anyway. You don't need to make grade 3 the hard way to fine tune it in between 3 and 3.5, you see, and spend the extra time doing that. Just use what's already made for you and go with it. You'll save yourself a lot of time. So just my thoughts on split printing, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.